Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is December 28, 2017. Right now I would like to continue my review of the article called The Cycle of Classification, DSM-I through DSM-5 by Blashfield, Keeley, Flanagan, and Miles. Now before I dive into that, the overall series title for this is The Psychology Bible, A Short History of the DSM. Even though most psychologists and psychiatrists are not really comfortable with referring to it as their Bible, it's just sort of a term that has emerged that people tend to apply to it on the outside. I would like to apologize as I listened back to the first portion of this. Sometimes when I said the word etiology, it sounded like ideology. So etiology is about the cause of a disease. Most of the time when you hear me use the word ideology, I use that as a pejorative term that's used to characterize the totalizing views of dangerous groups, not simply the way that Marxists use it as to cast aspersions upon the elite. So to sort of turn that around, and cast the aspersions back towards them where it properly belongs, I believe, not only towards the elite. So part 2 here. Section titled Research on Clinicians. After the publication of the DSM-IV, research on clinicians went beyond merely studying what kind of diagnostic decisions clinicians make to studying the mechanisms behind the diagnostic patterns. These studies found that clinicians' conceptualizations of the relationship among diagnostic categories is more similar to the DSM-I and DSM-II structure, in which clinicians first differentiate between organic and non-organic disorders and then psychotic and neurotic disorders. These studies suggested a startling disconnect between how clinicians think of mental disorders and how they are organized in the current DSM. The World Health Organization has made a point to study how clinicians understand the relationships among mental disorder categories and to align the ICD-11 with clinicians' conceptualizations. Now, before we get too far into this, they do seem to have more praise for the ICDs than they do for the DSMs. There should be a bit of a warning about that. I will cover something at the end of this article that will talk about some of the problems with what the WHO is doing with the ICD. Anyway, we continue here. The samples collected by these studies are broad, being conducted in as many as 64 countries with over 1,800 participants. The findings indicated that clinicians' conceptualizations of mental disorders are strikingly consistent, although not identical to either the DSM or ICD systems. Now, I'm going to skip around more in this article than I did in the first one, where it was mostly a straight reading and then criticism and critique of it. There are more sections, I think, of this second part that don't need to be read. You can go and find it, for that. So I continue. Another interesting line of research on clinicians' conceptualizations after the DSM-IV was conducted by Woo Kyung-an and colleagues. This research investigated clinicians' views of the underlying bases of mental disorders and how those affect their diagnostic decisions. Kim and An, 2002, argued that clinicians use theories to represent mental disorders on the basis of how the symptoms are causally related rather than understanding mental disorders as lists of criteria. This is what some people have referred to as the field guide problem. There's actually a really good presentation that I found the other day, and I will link that below so that you can watch that for yourself, related to the field guide problem of the DSM. Continuing, later research found that clinicians' views of the biological and psychological basis of disorders are negatively related, such that clinicians believe medication to be more effective for biologically based mental disorders than psychotherapy. This research group also investigated clinicians' beliefs about the essences of mental disorders. Clinicians thought mental disorders had weaker essences than medical disorders and were hesitant to endorse the mental disorders were real or natural. And that probably because they're multi-causal. Expert clinicians were less likely to endorse that a mental disorder had a single underlying cause. This research was important as the DSM does not conceptualize disorders as being represented by causal theories, having a biological or psychological basis, or having an underlying essence, but An and colleagues showed that clinicians tend to think that way. The DSM-5 development process began in 1999, and the internet allowed the world to watch how the manual was built. That's actually not so true as it may appear from that line. The development of the DSM-5, unfortunately, was not a particularly open process, and I'll get into that more after this when I talk about the complaints from Alan Francis, who is a very prominent psychiatrist who also worked on the DSM-IV, and he's written extensively with his critiques of the development of DSM-5 and the many problems that are bound to fall out of that. Anyway, I continue here. Drafts of the DSM-5 were posted on the APA's website for people to make comments and suggestions. Now, this was probably not a particularly brilliant idea. They ended up getting something like 10,000 comments on the first two drafts. But these comments were not just from psychologists and psychiatrists. They're just from all kinds of people across the internet, which, tends to bring in lots of trolls and people who are not particularly informed about any of the process of what's taking place. Anyway, we continue. David Kupfer was appointed chair of the DSM-5 and began the process with goals of creating a revolutionary manual in terms of matching the classification system to modern molecular biology, cognitive and affective neuroscience, and psychometrics. He assembled 13 work groups that contained over 500 mental health professionals. 11 academic medical centers participated in the field trials to test the reliability of the proposed categories. In physical size, the DSM-5 grew to 947 pages. There were a total of 541 diagnostic categories, an increase of nearly 160 categories compared with that of the DSM-IV. However, the number of categories defined using diagnostic criteria dropped to 151 compared with the 201 categories in the DSM-IV with diagnostic criteria. Unlike the DSM-IV, there were no source books published. If you recall from the first part of this, there were some 3,000 pages of source book material that came out with the DSM-IV to document the processes used by the DSM-5 work groups when creating this classification. The rationales and reviews posted on the DSM-5 development website were taken down and cannot be retrieved, to which anyone should say why. The cost of the DSM-5 more than doubled to $199 per hardback copy. Now that brings me back to the table that I skipped over some portions of in the first part of this, so I will review the whole thing right now so that this gives you some context in case you missed that portion. So, edition 1 of the DSM. Okay, 1952 publication date, number of pages 132, number of diagnoses 128, revenue generated for the APA unknown at that time. Okay, that was probably not the primary motivation for it then, and that could be related to why we continue to get all these updates to the DSM. So DSM-2, publication date 1968, pages 119, diagnoses 193, revenue generated $1.27 million. DSM-3, 1980, publication date, number of pages 494, number of diagnoses 228, revenue $9.33 million. DSM-3-R, 1987, 567 pages, 253 diagnoses, $16.65 million. DSM-IV, published in 1994, 886 pages, 383 diagnoses, generated $120 million. DSM-IV-TR, published in 2000, number of pages 943, diagnoses 383, and the revenue was unknown at the time of the creation of this table. DSM-5, published 2013, number of pages 947, number of diagnoses exploded to 541, and revenue generated, as you can imagine, from the $199 per hardback copy cost would be off the scales. There's also the interesting matter of the disconnect between the diagnostic categories and those that were defined. So it moves down into another section here. It says one of the interesting changes in the DSM-5 was that this edition actually had a distinct decrease in the number of diagnostic categories that were defined. This decrease is particularly striking because the number of categories with definitions had consistently increased across the editions. Conversely, the total number of diagnostic categories in this classification system increased markedly. Next section here, with the progression of large-scale family adoption and genome-wide association studies, disorders once thought to be separate have been shown to actually share underlying genetic similarities. Now, I don't know why that would be surprising at all, but sometimes you do have to have the science to back up things that you already suspect to be the case. Additionally, entire categories of disorders, i.e. the anxiety disorders, likely stem from the same genetic variations, but are cut apart into different diagnoses based on phenomenology, meaning what do the appearances seem to be, and tradition, e.g. social phobia, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. What is inherited is likely underlying brain circuits that influence the individual to respond to the environment in an anxious way rather than a specific disorder. And here I wrote to the side, it would be really nice if they gave us some examples of what they were talking about. I'm actually shocked that they did not provide those. Perhaps they were in and they had to edit those out for some reason. I don't know. And we moved down past some of their other goals here that they talked about to the section called Recommendations for Future DSMs, which, overall is a series of sober recommendations. The DSM editions, in addition to growing in size, have grown in the extent of the controversy surrounding them. The issues with the DSM-III and DSM-IIIR were the schism between the biological pro-science wing of the APA and the psychoanalytic pro-clinical wing. Now, I find that a little bit odd that they characterize one side as pro-science, which by implication, of course, means the other side may be anti-science or something. And I wrote out to the side on the psychoanalytic pro-clinical wing, do they mean this is something that's speculative or mythopoetic or what? It's a little bit hard to tell precisely what they meant by that. For the DSM-IV, the strongest critics of that system were the feminists, who viewed many of the DSM changes as potentially destructive to women. With the DSM-V, controversy erupted over the potentially secretive process that was being used to make decisions, as well as the corrupting influence of income and its potential revenues. More than once, important decisions that affected the final outcome of a DSM categorization system were made at the level of the Board of Trustees of the APA. The claim that the DSMs represent the best science possible is not credible when the final arbitrator of decision-making is not a scientific body but the leaders of an organization or profit motives. For instance, one speculation about why the DSM-V PD section ended up looking like it did was that adopting already existing dimensional models for this area of psychopathology was not in the financial interests of the APA because copyrights for those existing measurement instruments were held by others. And another thing to me that they don't mention here that immediately leaps to mind is, do children have an interest group protecting them? I don't see anywhere in here for any of the DSMs that children have adequate representation at all. And of course, children cannot stand for and represent themselves, so they do have to have someone to speak on their behalf. And I do not see any examples of that whatsoever. And they continue the recommendations here. Increased transparency about finances. This is a really important section. We recommend that the APA make all final records about the DSM, both past and present, publicly available. This would include information about royalties, if any, and honoraria paid to individuals involved with these additions and funding from pharmaceutical or other companies that could experience a financial impact because of DSM-influenced decisions, etc. Simply making this information available would go a long way towards alleviating concerns that financial decisions have driven the DSM process. The APA instituted a mandatory financial disclosure policy for the DSM-5 panel and work group members. However, some argue that openness about financial ties to industry does not limit bias, and many DSM-5 Task Force members reported financial ties to pharmaceutical companies. That should not come as a surprise to anybody. Next portion, clarify the goals of the DSM. We recommend that the DSM clarify its mission. Is it designed to aid researchers in communally defining targets for study or aid mental health practitioners in their work? These different values appear to be in conflict. Create a research agenda, ideally to move the field toward a better understanding of etiology, origins of disease. Kupfer and Regier in 2011 wrote a commentary about this, which stated that science is not yet at the place that clinicians can order a blood test and diagnose a mental disorder. Use the revenue from the DSM-5 to fund a research agenda. Considerable criticism is levied for the amount of revenue the DSMs generate For the APA, these criticisms might be allayed somewhat if the revenue were used to improve the DSM. Develop and fund a research agenda about how clinicians understand and use mental disorders. Reduce political bias in the development of the DSM. I don't know how they're going to do that, but it's a nice suggestion, I suppose. Social psychology has shown how political processes work better with an optimal amount of divergent opinions. Groups that are too homogenous are susceptible to groupthink, and that's something that's pointed out by Jonathan Haidt, and the reason that he has formed the Heterodox Academy for all kinds of academics to come together who actually do have differing views. And I do have plans to cover some of Jonathan's work. I'm not real sure how to pronounce his last name properly. Some people say Haidt, others say Haidt. It is spelled H-A-I-D-T. I think it's Haidt, but I could be wrong. Anyway, we continue. Include consumers, advocates, family members, and policymakers as active voting members on the committees and work groups in large enough numbers, e.g. 50%, so they move beyond tokenism and have a significant influence. Develop an independent oversight committee. And then their summary. Humans naturally attempt to sort and make sense of their environments, including how to classify psychopathology. Different methods are developed, taxonomies, in an attempt to most accurately represent reality. There are scientific pros and cons to each method, and politics play a role in deciding which methods are used. Throughout the histories of the DSMs, the researchers and clinicians have been struggling with similar issues, and these issues have not been resolved with the newly released DSM-5. We still do not know the etiology of mental disorders or when dimensions are better to use in classifying them as opposed to discrete categories. Theoretical positions oppose one another, which is good for science in that it allows theories to be falsified. Popper, 1985, which is a republication of an older one from the 1930s. But if bad money and self-serving biases influence the system more than the data. The DSM-5 did not meet its revolutionary goals. Just like eager but well-intentioned politicians who take office and then realize the dynamics of Washington, the DSM-5 did not make the changes it said it would. It is working not only with science, but also with people and politics. The themes will likely continue as psychiatry inches forward in attempting to understand psychopathology. So now we'll get into some of the complaints about the development of the DSM-5 from Alan Francis. Francis, American psychiatrist, early career spent at Cornell University Medical Center, became chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Duke University, helped to develop the DSM-IV, became critical of the DSM-5, and has written extensively about it. We get into a portion here that is from psychiatrictimes.com called DSM-5 Badly Off Track. This was from June 26, 2009. A series of questions and answers with Francis about it. One of the questions, in your opinion, what has gone wrong in the DSM-5 process? Francis says, the most fundamental errors have been its completely inexplicable secrecy and the lack of openness to outside influence and criticism. I simply can't recall a single moment of work on the DSM-3, 3R, or 4 when there was anything remotely worth keeping secret. Restricting the free flow of ideas creates enormous blind spots that greatly increase the risk of damaging unintended consequences. Specifically, it was a huge mistake to require that the DSM-5 workgroup members signed a confidentiality agreement. Another part of it says, what are the risks that you're so concerned about? He says, unless DSM-5 changes course dramatically, it will introduce numerous new, relatively untested categories that will greatly jack up the rates of mental disorders. Many people will be inappropriately identified as mentally ill and will receive excessive treatment. The pharmaceutical industry will have a field day, of course. 2 necessary forms of protection should have been established to prevent this. 1, a requirement that all changes be supported by a high threshold of systematically gathered empirical evidence, and 2, a careful risk-benefit analysis of the potential negative impact of each and every change. It's very obvious that neither of those 2 things took place at all. Another one here, what else do you think needs to be done now? He says, the problems with the DSM-5 are deeply embedded and unlikely to be corrected from within. I think that the APA trustees need to establish an external review committee charged with studying the progress on DSM-5 and recommending that what those next steps should be. Serious consideration should also be given to having a more flexible publication deadline to make sure the DSM-5 will be a usable manual and will help psychiatry for years to come. There's another one from Medscape called What's Wrong with the DSM-5? This is Stephen Strahovski, MD, and Alan Francis, June 1st, 2012. And it begins with an editor's note. It says the 5th edition of the DSM is scheduled for release in May 2013. As preliminary draft revisions to the current DSM diagnostic criteria have been made available for review, multiple prominent psychiatrists have spoken out against finalizing a revised edition at this time. The proposed updates were addressed at this year's APA annual meeting, and recently it was revealed on DSM-5.org that 2 controversial contention proposals, attenuated psychosis syndrome and mixed anxiety depressive disorder, will now be included in Section 3 of the revised manual, meaning that more research is required before consideration as formal disorders. Dr. Alan J. Francis, MD, Professor Emeritus at Duke University, Chair of the DSM-IV Task Force, has been an outspoken dissenter against numerous proposed DSM-5 revisions. Medscape recently invited Dr. Stephen Strahovski, Chairman, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience, University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, to interview Dr. Francis about his views on revising psychiatry's principal diagnostic resource. Introduction. Dr. Strahovski to Dr. Francis. You've been fairly critical of the creation of the newest psychiatric diagnostic manual, DSM-5. What is your background that allows you to comment? And what are your major concerns, particularly in light of the announcement this week that 2 of the more controversial proposals should be dropped? Dr. Francis, my most relevant background was working on DSM-3, 3R, and chairing the DSM-IV Task Force, conducting research on psychiatric diagnosis, and perhaps equally important, having evaluated and treating many thousands of patients. My great fear is that DSM-5 will inappropriately expand the boundaries of psychiatry and increase our already existing problem of diagnostic inflation. That's the bloat problem that I referred to in the first portion of this. This will result in inappropriate medication use, unnecessary stigma, and misallocation of scarce mental health resources. The DSM-5 proposal that got me started on this reluctant crusade was, quote, psychosis risk, since renamed attenuated psychotic symptoms. Psychosis risk is a well-intentioned research diagnosis aimed at preventing or reducing the burden of schizophrenia. However, it would be terrible, unintended consequences were it to become an official DSM-5 disorder and be widely applied in general clinical practice. Most of the leading researchers in the field are against its premature inclusion in DSM-5, and thankfully the DSM-5 Task Force just announced they will drop the proposed change. That the DSM-5 team finally backed down on its worst suggestion is a big plus. Thank goodness that psychosis risk is no longer in play. Also good is their rejection of mixed anxiety depression and the partial correction of what had been a ridiculously loose definition of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, allowing for onset as late as age 12, which would confound ADHD with other causes of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and distractibility. That said, there are many other radical and potentially dangerous ideas in the DSM-5. Dr. Strahovski, the pushback to not releasing a new edition might be that DSM-IV is old enough now that there has been sufficient advances that a new DSM is needed. Do you think that assumption is correct? Dr. Francis, the exponential basic science advances in understanding how the normal brain works have not yet translated into any advances in how clinical psychiatry is practiced. Regrettably and surprisingly, there are still no biological tests for any of the mental disorders. We are years away from having an Alzheimer's battery, and there is also nothing very encouraging in the diagnostic pipeline for any of the other problems we treat. The brain has turned out to be elusively complex. The more we learn about it, the more we understand how little we know and how tough it will be to pin down pathogeneses. Each disorder in the DSM is probably just a final common presentation caused by hundreds of different and heterogeneous biological pathways. Clearly, it will take decades to make meaningful steps in understanding psychopathology. In the meantime, we are left with a descriptive psychiatry that has great limitations but enormous practical uses and influence. It makes no sense to change the system based on the arbitrary decisions of those in charge of the rewrite. Indeed, a strong case could be made that the world would be a better place were we still using DSM-3, which is something I pointed out in the first portion of this. Each change in a DSM is an opportunity for clinical and forensic misuse with unpredictable and harmful unintended consequences. Changes are also costly to psychiatric research in direct ways, such as the cost of changing instruments midstream, and even more importantly, in indirect ways, such as the non-comparability of findings across time. It might be worth the risk and cost of DSM-5 changes if there were compelling science supporting them, but there isn't. That's why I've been calling for an independent scientific review of the DSM-5 proposals, and also why APA has refused. I would bet my house that none of the DSM-5 changes would ever make it through an impartial and rigorous scientific review. Dr. Strahovski, but isn't the goal of the DSM to provide guidance to psychiatrists in order to better define patients' cases so as to better direct treatment? Wouldn't it be helpful then to expand and identify as many cases as possible, which might very well require new diagnoses and descriptions? What are the real risks to our patients or to psychiatry? Dr. Francis, we want to identify the patients we can help, and we want to avoid identifying the ones who don't need treatment or who may be harmed by treatment. Psychiatry does best with and is most needed by patients who are moderately to severely ill. Studies consistently show that they benefit with strong treatment effects. In contrast, studies of the mildly ill show equally consistently that they experience no significant benefit compared with placebo. We already have a perverse misallocation of resources, with 2/3 of severely depressed people receiving no mental health care, while many on antidepressants are placebo responders who don't really even need them. DSM-5 will make this much worse by dramatically reducing thresholds for existing disorders and by introducing new and untested disorders with high prevalence rates. Literally tens of millions of new, quote, patients will be created overnight with no evidence that they can be accurately identified, no proven effective treatment, and every indication that the medication treatments offered can have very harmful side effects. This will lead to worse directed treatments, more harm than good for patients, and even greater distortions in the allocation of scarce resources. And that is an excellent summary of the problems. And I'll move from that to a piece written here by Dr. Francis for Psychology Today. This was published December 2nd, 2012. DSM-5 is a guide, not a Bible. Ignore its 10 worst changes. APA approval of DSM-5 is a sad day for psychiatry. So he says here, the APA has given final approval to a deeply flawed DSM-5 containing many changes that seem clearly unsafe and scientifically unsound. My best advice to clinicians, to the press, and to the general public: be skeptical and don't follow DSM-5 blindly down a road likely to lead to massive overdiagnosis and harmful over-medication. And who would be interested in over-medication? Big Pharma? Nah, couldn't be. Fortunately, some of its most egregiously risky and unsupportable proposals were eventually dropped under great external pressure, most notably psychosis risk, mixed anxiety, depression, internet and sex addiction, rape as a mental disorder, cumbersome personality ratings, and a sharply lowered threshold for many existing disorders. The APA's deep dependence on the publishing profits generated by the DSM-5 business enterprise creates a far less pure motivation. There is an inherent and influential conflict of interest between the DSM-5 public trust and DSM-5 as a bestseller. When its deadlines were consistently missed due to poor planning and disorganized implementation, APA chose quietly to cancel the DSM-5 field testing step that was meant to provide it with a badly needed opportunity for quality control. The current draft has been approved and is now being rushed prematurely to press with incomplete field testing for one reason only: so that the DSM-5 publishing profits can fill the big hole in the APA's projected budget and return dividends on the exorbitant cost of $25 million that has been charged to DSM-5 preparation. So they will certainly went far beyond $25 million in their profits. And he goes down to the 10 things here that people should ignore. 1. Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. DSM-5 will turn temper tantrums into a mental disorder, a puzzling decision based on the work of only one research group. We have no idea whatever how this untested new diagnosis will play out in real-life practice settings, but my fear is that it will exacerbate, not relieve, the already excessive and inappropriate use of medication on young children. During the past 2 decades, child psychiatry has already provoked 3 fads, a tripling of attention deficit disorder, a more than 20 times increase in autistic disorder, and a 40 times increase in childhood bipolar disorder. The field should have felt chastened by this sorry track record and should engage itself now in the crucial task of correcting this problem. 2. Normal grief will become major depressive disorder, thus medicalizing and trivializing our expectable and necessary emotional reactions to the loss of a loved one, and substituting pills and superficial medical rituals for the deep consolations of family, friends, and religion, and the resiliency that comes with time and the acceptance of the limitations of life. So their answer, of course, is always, here, we're going to give you a pill. A pill is the answer to your problems. And even, something like grief that is naturally follows, a terrific loss. 3, the everyday forgetting characteristic of old age will now be misdiagnosed as minor neurocognitive disorder, creating a huge false positive population of people who are not at special risk for dementia, since there is no effective treatment for this, quote, condition, or for dementia itself. The label provides absolutely no benefit while creating great anxiety in those diagnosed, even for those at true risk for later developing dementia. It is a dead loss for the many who will be, unfortunately, mislabeled. 4. DSM-5 will likely trigger a fad of adult attention deficit disorder, leading to widespread misuse of stimulants. 5. Excessive eating 12 times in 3 months is no longer just a manifestation of gluttony and the easy availability of great tasting food. DSM-5 has instead turned it into a psychiatric illness called binge eating disorder. Another one here, first-time substance abusers will be lumped in definitionally with hardcore addicts, despite their very different treatment needs and prognosis and the stigma that this will cause for people. Another one, DSM-5 has created a slippery slope by introducing the concept of behavioral addictions that eventually can spread to make a mental disorder of everything that we like to do a lot. Watch out for careless overdiagnosis of internet and sex and the development of lucrative treatment programs to exploit these new markets. Another one, DSM-5 obscures the already fuzzy boundary called generalized anxiety disorder and the worries of everyday life. Small changes in definition can create millions of anxious new, quote, patients and expand the already widespread practice of inappropriately prescribing addicting anti-anxiety medications. Another one, DSM-5 has opened the gate even further to the already existing problem of misdiagnosis of PTSD, which is apparently a huge problem lately. Another section goes on here. Except for autism, all the DSM-5 changes loosen diagnosis and threaten to turn our current diagnostic inflation into diagnostic hyperinflation. Painful experience with previous DSMs teaches that if anything in the diagnostic system can be misused and turned into a fad, it will be. Many millions of people with normal grief, gluttony, distractibility, worries, reactions to stress, the temper tantrums of childhood, the forgetting of old age, and the behavioral addictions will soon be mislabeled as psychiatrically sick and given inappropriate treatment. People with real psychiatric problems that can be reliably diagnosed and effectively treated are already badly shortchanged. DSM-5 will make this worse by diverting attention and scarce resources away from the really ill and toward people with the everyday problems of life who will be harmed, not helped, when they are mislabeled as mentally ill. Our patients deserve better, society deserves better, and the mental health professionals deserve better. Caring for the mentally ill is a noble and effective profession, but we have to know our limits and stay within them. DSM-5 violates the most sacred and most frequently ignored tenet in medicine. First, do no harm. That's why this is such a bad moment. And then I go from there to some other general issues that are brought up in some of the videos that I'm going to link below related to nosology, the DSM, the ability to name, classify, and identify. And the person in this video will be pointing out how the DSM is not as good as a field guide because there's no blood test, there's no pathophysiology, no morphological structures of the brain that correspond 100% with disorders that are inside of the DSM-5. You have a whole variety of personality traits and other personal dispositions, and some of those are going to be unfortunately characterized as psychopathological disorders, which they really are not. And one of the things that he points out that was interesting from, I think it was the DSM-III, which led to an explosion in diagnoses and claims of disorders from PTSD to the satanic panic of the 1980s, where you had these recovered memories from children who said that they were being tortured and raped, and that certain other children were being murdered in daycare centers and all this kind of stuff. It was a huge hysteria in the mid to late 1980s, even a little into the early 1990s. And then he also talks about the recovered memory syndrome related to abductions. I think this research was primarily done by Dr. John Mack at Harvard University, which led to another massive controversy about whether a tenured professor could be investigated by his colleagues for the type of research that he was doing. And ultimately, he came out as a winner on that with the support of, I think it was Alan Dershowitz and others who spoke out on his behalf that allowed him to continue his alien abduction research, which for him, I think that he wasn't so much saying that this was an actual physical phenomenon so much as it was some kind of a mental or psychological issue, and he wrote several books about that. But I think that will be all for this one. Thank you. But before I truly go from here, I do want to point out there is an article actually that just came out this morning about the World Health Organization and how it will use the ICD to classify simply playing video games an awful lot as a disorder, as a mental illness for 2018. And I'll read part of this here. It says, despite shady details as well as the overreach and abuse of mental health classifications seen in non-democratic countries, the WHO will be adding gaming disorder to its ICD system in 2018. According to a preliminary draft, the 2018 International Classification of Diseases, the WHO's gaming disorder will be defined, and listen to the definition parameters of this. This is ridiculous for any of you who play games and all that. A pattern of persistent or recurrent gaming behavior, digital gaming, or video gaming, which may be online, i.e. over the internet, or offline, manifested by 1. Impaired control over gaming, e.g. onset, frequency, intensity, duration, termination, context. What on earth does that even mean? Lots of us like to play games, so what? 2. Increasing priority given to gaming to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities. And 3. Continuation or escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences, which of course they don't define what those are, and that is just so loosey-goosey that you could throw just about anybody into that who likes to play games a lot. I mean, I don't know. I don't really agree with that at all, but that's all. Thanks.